This is the story of Nahum, the quiet, watchful prophet who lived in the shadow of a city he'd never stepped foot in. His words would roar through time, reminding the world of a powerful truth. God is patient, but he will not ignore injustice forever. Nineveh. The name sounded like thunder to Nahum's ears. It was a city of towers and terror, vast and arrogant, its walls stretching wide as the sky. Its gates were carved with lions, its palaces filled with treasures stolen from crushed nations. It was proud, drenched in the blood of the innocent. Kings marched from its streets with cruelty on their lips and iron in their hands. And yet, for a time, God had spared it. Everyone remembered Jonah. Nahum had grown up hearing the stories, how Jonah had run from God's command, how he'd ended up in the belly of a great fish, and how, at last, he'd preached in Nineveh. One man's message had turned an entire city to its knees. Even the king had humbled himself, wrapping himself in sackcloth and ashes. That was 100 years ago, but Nineveh hadn't stayed humble. Instead, the city rose again in pride, stronger, richer, crueler. Now it swallowed entire kingdoms like bread. It mocked Yahweh, crushed his people, and filled the earth with fear. And still, there had been no fire from heaven, no floods, no shaking earth. That silence was what weighed most heavily on Nahum. He was not famous. He didn't come from a long line of priests or scribes. He lived in a quiet village called Elkosh, a place people barely mentioned on maps. His hands were stained from ink, not battle. He was a watcher, a listener, the kind of man who sat still while others spoke, but inside him burned a storm that wouldn't go out. He had known for some time now that he was a prophet. Not because someone told him, but because the words came to him like rain after a dry season. He felt God's burden like a weight on his chest. It filled his dreams. It stirred when he prayed. Sometimes he tried to ignore it, tried to be normal, but the fire would not leave him alone. He had heard it one night, a whisper in his sleep, low and firm. "Write it down, Nahum. What I show you. The time of patience is ending." That was the night the dreams began, not just of Nineveh's pride, but of its fall. Now, standing on the cliffs near his village, Nahum looked toward the horizon as the wind kicked up the dust. "I don't want to be like Jonah," he murmured aloud. "But I don't want to be silent either." He wasn't running. He wasn't begging God to spare the city. This was something different. This time, the message wasn't mercy. It was justice. And Nahum knew deep in his bones that his words would not make the people of Nineveh fall to their knees. They would not repent. They wouldn't care. But still, he had to speak. Because God had spoken to him. And when God speaks, the silence shatters. The sky above Elkosh darkened that afternoon, but it was not rain that troubled Nahum. He sat beneath the old sycamore tree, knees drawn to his chest, eyes on the farthest edge of the land where clouds hovered like waiting armies. He wasn't imagining them. The heaviness in the air was real. Something was coming, not just to Elkosh, but to the world. Nahum's home was small, nestled between two weather-bent hills and guarded by rows of almond trees. Chickens clucked softly near the fence. A crooked fence gate squeaked every time the wind passed through. It was a quiet life, but it did not feel peaceful anymore. He reached into the satchel beside him and pulled out a strip of parchment. His fingers were already stained with ink. He had written the first words of the vision 2 days ago, and every word since had come like thunder, deep, strong, and certain. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. Nahum stared at those lines, the weight of them sinking in. These were not soft words. These were not the kind of verses children would memorize in song, but they were true. His father used to say, "Justice is like a plumb line, Nahum. If the wall leans too far, it will fall, no matter how long it stands." Nahum hadn't understood that as a boy, but he did now. He remembered the way the traders spoke of Nineveh, how its armies marched across the land like locusts, stripping every vine bare, how the people of Israel had cried for help, and the sky had stayed silent. For years, Nahum had wondered why God didn't act, why he let such evil go unchecked, why Jonah's generation got mercy and his generation got silence. But now, Nahum understood. Mercy does not mean permission. Mercy is a chance to turn back, and Nineveh hadn't. He rose to his feet and stepped out toward the path, his scroll tucked under his arm. There were people who needed to hear, not just Assyrians, his own people too. The ones who had stopped believing that God would do anything. The ones who had given up hope that justice would ever come. As he walked, he passed the well at the edge of the village. Two older women were pulling up water, their arms strong despite their age. "Nahum," one of them called, "your mother's looking for you. She says you've been wandering again." "I've been thinking," he replied gently. "She worries," said the other woman with a smile. "You don't eat. You don't sleep. You stare at the clouds and talk to the wind." Nahum smiled softly. "Sometimes the wind answers." The women exchanged looks, but said nothing more. They had known Nahum since he was a child, quiet, thoughtful, a little strange, but never unkind. He walked on. Children ran past him chasing a wooden hoop with sticks. Their laughter rang in the air, light and free. Nahum watched them, his heart both heavy and hopeful. The judgment God had shown him wasn't meant to destroy joy. It was meant to protect it, to restore what had been crushed. In the distance, the Temple Mount shimmered with late afternoon light. A group of elders sat in the shade, arguing about taxes or politics or maybe both. Nahum didn't stop. He wasn't called to debate. He was called to warn. As he reached the outskirts of the village where the ground grew rocky and the almond trees thinned out, he whispered the words again, just to himself. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished." He paused, then added softly, "Not even Nineveh." The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the world in gold and fire. The vision in his chest burned brighter now. God was on the move. Nahum turned toward the hills and began to climb, scroll in hand, fire in his bones. The climb from the village led Nahum to a high ridge where the stones were warm and the wind ran wild. He had come to this place since he was a child, not to escape, but to listen. It was always quiet up here. From this height, the hills rolled like waves, and the sky stretched wide enough to make a man feel small. But Nahum didn't mind feeling small. It helped him remember that the world didn't revolve around him. It revolved around God. He sat with his legs crossed, scroll still in hand, heart still stirred. The words he had written earlier lingered in his mind. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. He will not leave the guilty unpunished." For years he had believed that truth even when the world made it difficult to, especially when the world made it difficult to. Nahum had grown up hearing the stories, how Jonah long ago had been called to warn Nineveh, how he had run, how he had been swallowed by a fish and spat back out, how he had finally obeyed and the city had repented. That had been a miracle. It had proven God's mercy, but time had proven something else. Nineveh didn't stay changed. What had seemed like repentance turned out to be fear, temporary, shallow, and gone too soon. Within a generation, the Assyrian kings returned to their old ways, dragging their enemies through the streets, stamping out cities, carving cruelty into stone. Now, 100 years later, Nahum was the one with the burden. He had not asked for it. He had not chased it. But the vision came anyway. It had begun slowly, a stirring in the middle of the night, a single word whispered without sound: Nineveh. And then the images followed: destruction, collapse, the proud brought low, the mighty undone, the evil made to tremble. Nahum hadn't told anyone at first. Who would believe that someone like him, quiet, unknown, untrained, could carry a message so fierce? He wasn't from a line of prophets. His father was a woodworker. His mother pressed oil from olives. His hands had built fences and carried water, not scrolls. And yet, the fire in his chest would not be ignored. So he began to write. Each word came like a drumbeat, not his own ideas, but a message that felt older than time. A message of justice, a message of truth. And the strange part, he felt peace as he wrote it. Not fear, not anger, peace. Because it wasn't born from revenge, it was born from God's holiness. Nahum stood now, the ridge beneath him solid as the message he carried. Far beyond the hills, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in copper and deep gold. The world below him remained unchanged, still green, still quiet. But Nahum knew the truth. Judgment didn't always start with earthquakes. Sometimes it started with a single voice, and his time had come. The next morning came without sound. Fog hung low in the valley, brushing softly against the rooftops of Elkosh like a veil. The village stirred slowly. Roosters crowed, distant dogs barked, and the smell of baking barley bread drifted through the air. But Nahum's house remained still. He sat at a small wooden table near the window, the scroll rolled tightly in front of him. His fingers tapped the grain of the wood, not from nerves, but from readiness. The vision had been written. The message was complete. And now, he had to share it. But where and how? Elkosh wasn't a city of kings. There were no courts, no palaces, no stone walls echoing with important footsteps. The people here were farmers, shepherds, weavers. If he stood in the center of the village and shouted, most would shake their heads and return to their work. Not because they didn't care, but because judgment felt far away to them. What did Nineveh's fate have to do with olive trees and milk goats? But Nahum knew better. What happened to Nineveh would ripple through every village, every home, every family that had suffered under its rule. And justice wasn't just about the wicked falling. It was about the weary standing again. That was the part many forgot. He stood, grabbed the scroll, and stepped outside into the cool morning. The fog clung to the almond trees, soft and pale. A cart creaked down the path in the distance, led by a sleepy ox and a boy with straw in his hair. Nahum nodded to them and took the narrow path that curved toward the far edge of the village. There, nestled between two rocky hills, was a wide, flat space where people often gathered to pray or share news. Not many were there this early, just a few elders warming their hands near a small fire. Nahum approached quietly and stood at the edge of the firelight. He didn't shout. He didn't make an announcement. He simply unrolled the scroll. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady, like water slipping between stones. The Lord is a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him, but with an overwhelming flood, he will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into darkness." The men turned, surprised. One of them, old Lamech, raised an eyebrow. "What's this, Nahum?" Nahum looked him in the eye. "A message. One I didn't ask for. One I can't ignore." There was no need to argue, no need to explain. The scroll spoke for itself, and the weight in Nahum's voice was enough to quiet the few gathered there. More would hear it soon. But Nahum knew it wouldn't be his voice that shook the earth. It would be the truth behind it. By midday, word had spread. Not quickly, not loudly, but like an ember passed from hand to hand, the message began to move. Nahum didn't return home. He stayed near the fire pit on the edge of the village, sitting quietly with the scroll open across his lap. He wasn't forcing it on anyone. He didn't need to. The people were coming on their own. Not in crowds, but in twos and threes. A shepherd with dust on his tunic paused on his way to the fields. An older woman with clay-stained hands listened while kneading her dough nearby. A group of children peeked from behind a stone wall, wide-eyed but curious. Nahum read again, slower this time, letting the words settle like stones in water. "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." He paused, eyes tracing the horizon, then continued. "The Lord is against you, Nineveh. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness, and the kingdoms your shame." The fire crackled beside him. No one spoke. These were not gentle words. They were fierce, sharp. But Nahum's face remained calm. There was no hatred in his voice, only truth. Many in Elkosh had lost family to Assyrian violence. Some had watched brothers dragged off in chains. Others had buried sons, swallowed by wars they never asked for. The pain was old, but not forgotten. Nahum finished the reading and rolled the scroll gently. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't explain himself. He simply waited. A young man named Tirzah stepped forward, arms crossed. His voice held doubt. "So, it's finally coming? The fall of Nineveh?" Nahum looked at him steady. "It is." Tirzah scoffed softly. "We've waited a long time for justice. How do we know it's not just talk again?" Nahum didn't answer right away. He simply reached into his pouch and pulled out a small piece of clay, a seal impression from a broken Assyrian tax record, the mark of a lion with a sword still pressed into its surface. "This," he said, holding it up, "was found near the border, left behind when their soldiers passed through. They taxed a widow's land so heavily her sons fled into the hills. She never saw them again." He set it by the fire and said no more. Tirzah stared at it, then turned and walked away in silence. The others remained. They didn't need more convincing. They only needed hope that justice was still possible. Nahum looked at them, not as a prophet above, but as a man among them. Someone who had waited too. Someone who had wept and wondered and watched while evil seemed to win. But not anymore. The winds were changing, and Nahum knew Nineveh would fall, not by his hand, but by God's. The evening brought a golden hush across the hills, and the fires in Elkosh flickered to life one by one. Even the animals seemed quieter than usual, as if the land itself was listening. Nahum sat alone beneath the sycamore tree near the ridge, the same place where he often met the wind. The scroll lay beside him, but he wasn't reading it now. He was remembering. Not a dream, a moment. It had come weeks before the words ever reached his mouth. He had woken in the middle of the night, breath frozen in his chest, sweat on his forehead. But there had been no fear, just clarity. In his mind, he had seen it. Nineveh, proud and unshaken, suddenly crumbling like brittle clay. He saw soldiers run with no orders, gates break open not by human hands, but by water. Yes, water. The river that had once protected the city had turned against it. He could still hear the roar in his ears. And then he saw something else. Silence. Not the kind that comes before a storm, but the kind that follows the end of something large. That was when he knew it wasn't just a warning. It was a certainty. He hadn't told anyone about that night, not even Reuel. He didn't know why God chose him, only that he had. And the burden of the vision was not something he could set down. He opened the scroll again, tracing the next lines with his finger. Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile, with water around her? Yet she was taken captive. Her infants dashed to pieces at every street corner. He had to pause. Even reading it made his stomach tighten. These were not poetic warnings or gentle nudges toward repentance. These were declarations, final, definite. God had waited. Now he would act. And it wasn't just about punishing the wicked. It was about restoring what had been broken. Nahum had come to understand that God's justice wasn't simply destruction, it was protection for the innocent, relief for the oppressed, healing for the wounded. If Nineveh did not fall, others could never rise. The air grew cooler. The stars blinked to life above him. In the village below, a mother sang softly to her child. Somewhere else, a door creaked closed. A dog barked once and then was quiet again. Nahum closed his eyes. The words were written. The fire had been lit, and the wheels of heaven were already turning. The next morning, Nahum walked through the village with purpose. Not rushed, but steady. The scroll was tucked into a leather sling across his shoulder. The time for silence had passed. His words had started to reach people, and now the questions were coming. He reached the well just as a few men were drawing water. One of them, a rugged man named Harim, straightened when he saw Nahum approach. So it's true, Harim said, narrowing his eyes. You're the one who's been telling folks Nineveh's going to fall. Nahum nodded. I'm not telling them. God is. Harim snorted. Jonah said the same thing 100 years ago, didn't he? And yet here we are, still under the shadow of Assyria. Jonah warned them, Nahum replied, and they listened, briefly. But their repentance didn't last. Their violence grew worse than before. Another man, Eliezer, leaned on the well's edge. You say the city will fall. When? How? I wasn't given dates, Nahum said, only certainty. Harim folded his arms. Forgive me, but that's not much to hold on to. We've been waiting a long time for justice, Nahum. Words don't stop swords. No, Nahum agreed, but truth does. And truth is what I was given. He pulled the scroll from his sling and unrolled it slowly. His voice, calm but filled with quiet strength, filled the space between them. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Harim opened his mouth to reply but said nothing. Nahum looked between them both. Do you hear what that means? The ones who led them, gone. The ones who ordered the cruelty, silenced. God himself will scatter them, not one man's sword, not one nation's army, but his own hand. For a moment, the only sound was the water sloshing in the well bucket. Eliezer spoke softly. If you're right, then this is the beginning of something new. Nahum gave a small nod, a beginning for us, but an end for them. Harim finally stepped back and took his full bucket. I'm not sure what I believe yet, he muttered, but something about you, Nahum, it doesn't feel like guesswork. Nahum said nothing, only rolled the scroll gently and returned it to its sling. As he turned to walk back toward the ridge, he heard Eliezer whisper to Harim behind him, I think he's serious, and I think we ought to listen. The words weren't loud, but Nahum heard them, and for the first time in many days, he smiled. Just a little, because even the smallest seed of belief could take root, and justice, once planted, was already growing. That evening, Nahum returned to the ridge just before sunset. The sky glowed with streaks of orange and violet, and the valley below was bathed in a soft, peaceful light. But inside Nahum's chest, the fire of the message still burned. The words didn't fade after speaking them, they deepened. They became more real, more urgent. He sat cross-legged in the tall grass, the scroll open once again. He reread the lines not because he had forgotten, but because each time they sounded different, as if God's voice was pressing deeper into the world through the same message. Footsteps crunched behind him. Nahum turned slightly. It was Reuel. His cousin sat down beside him without a word, arms resting on his knees. For a while, the two sat in silence, watching the sun drift behind the hills. You've got the village talking, Reuel said at last. I expected they would, Nahum replied quietly. Reuel glanced at him. It's more than talk. Some are nervous, some are angry, a few are hopeful. He paused, but all of them are watching you now. I didn't choose that, Nahum said, but I can't stop it either. Reuel nodded slowly. I know. I just wonder how much longer you can carry something this heavy. Nahum didn't answer right away. He reached out and picked a thin blade of grass, rolling it between his fingers. I think of all the people Nineveh has crushed, he finally said. The villages burned, the children taken, the temples destroyed, and I wonder how they carried their suffering. If I can carry even a piece of their justice, then it's not too heavy. Reuel lowered his head. That's a hard answer. It's a hard world, Nahum said. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the grass around them. Reuel stared out over the valley. So you really believe Nineveh will fall? Nahum turned to him, eyes clear. Yes, not because I want it to, not because I hate them, but because God told me so, and God's patience, though it's deep, is not endless. Reuel sighed. And us? What happens to people like us when an empire like that crumbles? Nahum's voice was firm now. We remember what mercy looks like. We rebuild. We live differently. Justice is not only about punishment, it's about healing. A long silence followed. Then Reuel stood, brushing dust from his robe. Well, if this is the beginning of something new, you better keep your strength. He started down the ridge, then turned back with a crooked smile. And try to eat something, would you? You look like a tree that forgot how to drink. Nahum let out a dry chuckle. I'll try. Reuel left, and Nahum sat alone again. The stars were beginning to peek through the clouds. He picked up the scroll, and this time his eyes rested on one line in particular. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. For a moment, Nahum closed his eyes, because even in a message about destruction, there was still something beautiful. Peace was coming, not for the proud, but for the faithful, and that too was worth writing down. The next day came with heavy clouds rolling in from the east, low, gray, and slow-moving, like a warning wrapped in silence. Nahum remained in the village this time, standing beneath the awning of the olive press. A few men had gathered to escape the drizzle, and by now they all knew who he was. They weren't whispering anymore. They came with questions. Old Lamech was first to speak, pulling his damp cloak tighter. "Nahum, you say Nineveh will fall, but they're stronger than ever. Their kings brag that even the gods of conquered nations couldn't stop them. So what makes you think your God will?" Nahum looked at him calmly. "Not think, Lamech. No. They mistake silence for weakness. But God's silence has never meant he was absent. It meant he was waiting." A younger man near the wall folded his arms. "And what if they come here again? When Nineveh falls, won't their enemies rise up? Won't the violence just shift hands?" Nahum shook his head. "This is not the rising of another cruel power. This is the end of cruelty. This is God's judgment, not a human war." He opened the scroll again, his voice cutting through the cool air. "I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave you no prey on the earth. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard." The men fell quiet. It was strange to hear the voice of God speak not in pleading, but in finality, not "return to me," but "I am against you." Nahum saw it in their faces. This wasn't just about Nineveh. It was about what God was willing to do for the sake of the innocent, for the sake of those who had prayed for years with no answer. A woman named Abiah stepped forward, a basket of olives in her arms. Her voice trembled slightly, but it held strength underneath. "My daughter's husband died in a raid," she said. "Assyrian soldiers came through our land like wolves. They spared no one. She weeps every day. We tried to tell her God was watching, but she stopped believing. Do you really think he saw her?" Nahum's voice softened. "Yes, I believe he saw all of it, every tear, every cry. That's why he speaks now, not because he forgot, but because he didn't." Abiah stared at him for a moment, then slowly nodded and turned away, walking back toward her home. The others drifted off soon after, each one quiet in thought. Nahum remained under the awning, alone with the scroll. He knew this wasn't the end of their questions or their doubts. But for the first time, he felt the message settling in, not just in the ears of the people, but in their hearts. And once the truth settles in the heart, even the strongest empires can't stand against it. The rain finally came at night. It wasn't harsh or sudden, just steady. A curtain of soft water falling from the clouds, draping the village in silence. Most people stayed inside, tending small fires, sharing warm bread, listening to the storm speak against their rooftops. But Nahum stood just outside his doorway, his cloak pulled tight, his scroll dry under a flap of leather. He watched the water pool at his feet and trail down the hills like tiny rivers. Even the olive trees looked like they were bowing. Something about the rain reminded him of the vision again, of the flood that rushed through Nineveh's gates. Not just a flood of water, but a flood of consequences. He whispered into the night, not knowing if anyone but God could hear. It's not just a storm, it's a reckoning. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the earth washed and quiet. Nahum made his way to the center of the village again, where the paths were soft with mud and the air smelled like clean stone and wet leaves. To his surprise, a small group was already waiting for him. Not just men this time, women, teenagers, even an elder leaning on a crooked staff. They didn't speak when he arrived. They just waited. Nahum nodded to them, opened the scroll, and began. Your people are scattered on the mountains, with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? He looked up from the scroll. You see, the fall of Nineveh is not just about vengeance, Nahum said. It's about relief from the cruelty, from the fear, from the belief that evil can go unchecked forever. A young woman near the back lifted her hand, hesitant. But what if they repent, like they did before? Nahum took a moment before answering. Then God would know it. But this message, it isn't like Jonah. This isn't a warning calling for change. This is a declaration, final. It's not about what might happen. It's about what will. The crowd remained still. Then the elder with the staff stepped forward slowly. His voice was gravelly. I remember when the soldiers came through. I was a boy. My father tried to hide the livestock. They beat him in front of us, took everything. He looked at Nahum, eyes glassy. You say God saw that? Nahum met his gaze. He saw all of it. And his silence was not approval. It was mercy, waiting for repentance. That time is over now. The old man gave a slow nod, stepped back, and leaned again on his staff. Nahum rolled the scroll, tucking it back into his sling. He had spoken with conviction before, but today felt different. The people had not only heard the words, they had believed them, and sometimes that belief was more powerful than any army. The days that followed were still and heavy, like the quiet before harvest. Nahum continued his routine, not because he was trying to be seen, but because the burden hadn't lifted. The message had been shared, but it was still alive in him. He felt it in his bones, in the breeze, in the soft hush of dawn when the earth held its breath. One afternoon, as he passed through the olive grove near the edge of the village, a voice called out to him from beneath a tree. Nahum, wait up! He turned to see Tirzah, the same man who had doubted him near the well. This time, Tirzah looked less defiant. He was holding a clay jar in one hand and had a satchel slung over his shoulder. I've been thinking about what you said, he continued, walking beside him now. About Nineveh, about justice. I used to believe God forgot us, or maybe he was too far away to care. Nahum didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch. Tirzah sighed. But now I wonder. Maybe the waiting was part of the justice. That caught Nahum's attention. He stopped and turned to face him. Explain. Tirzah adjusted the strap on his shoulder. I mean, maybe if God had struck Nineveh the first time they did evil, no one would have seen how deep the rot really was. But now, after all this time, there's no question. Everyone knows how cruel they've become. There's no defending them anymore. Nahum nodded slowly. You're beginning to understand. Tirzah looked at him, uncertain. So what happens next? Do we just wait and watch the world burn? No, Nahum said. We prepare. Prepare for what? For what comes after justice, Nahum replied. For rebuilding, for mercy, for peace. Tirzah stared off toward the hills. That's the part no one ever talks about. Because most don't stay long enough to see it, Nahum said gently. But you will. Some of us will. And when the noise dies down and the dust settles, we'll be the ones left to build something better. They stood for a moment in the shade of the tree. A soft wind brushed through the branches, scattering tiny leaves like whispers. I'm not a prophet, Tirzah said, almost apologetically. You don't have to be, Nahum answered. You only have to be faithful. Tirzah gave a small, thoughtful nod, then turned back toward the village, the clay jar bouncing gently at his side. Nahum remained beneath the tree, eyes lifted toward the hills. The message had gone out, the fire had been lit. And now, quietly, faithfully, hope was beginning to take root in the ashes. Nahum had never imagined that his words would travel beyond El-Kosh, but days later, they did. It started with a traveler, a merchant passing through on his way to Samaria. He had heard whispers in a nearby village about a man with a scroll who spoke of Nineveh's fall. Curious, he had come to see for himself. Nahum was sitting on a stone bench beneath the olive trees, speaking to a small group of villagers about what it meant to trust in God when justice seemed slow. The merchant stood quietly at the edge, listening without interrupting. When Nahum finished, the man stepped forward. You speak with certainty, he said, as if the future has already happened. Nahum met his eyes, because in the mind of God it has. The merchant tilted his head. There have been many who claimed such things, but you speak differently, not like a man chasing a crowd. I didn't chase anything, Nahum said simply. The message came to me. I only carried it. The merchant crossed his arms. And if I tell others? If your words leave El-Kosh, are you ready for that? Nahum nodded once. If the message is from God, it was never meant to stay in one place. The merchant considered him for a long moment, then reached into his satchel. I'll copy what I heard, word for word. If it is truth, it will stand. He stayed that evening, and Nahum recited the scroll from beginning to end. His voice was steady, but there was something deeper now, like the message had grown larger than him. That night, as the village settled into sleep and the last lanterns dimmed, Nahum sat alone near the edge of the olive grove. He thought of Jonah again, how he had run, how he had returned, how the city had repented. And now, a generation later, another message had been spoken. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a promise, not just of judgment, but of relief. Of peace for those who had suffered, of hope for those who had nearly given up. He looked out toward the north, where the stars hung low above the hills. Nineveh still stood in the distance, proud and glittering in its strength, but its towers would fall, not with noise, not with fanfare, but with the slow, unstoppable hand of a God who never forgets. And somewhere deep in Nahum's heart, he felt the shift already beginning. Weeks passed. The air grew cooler. Leaves began to fall. The people of El-Kosh carried on with their lives, tending flocks, gathering olives, repairing fences, but something had changed. There was a new weight in their prayers, a new clarity in their eyes. They spoke less of fear and more of justice. Not the kind men seek through revenge, but the kind only God can give, where the scales are balanced by mercy and truth. Nahum walked the ridge more often now. He still carried the scroll, but he didn't need it anymore. The words were a part of him. He had written them in ink, yes, but also in obedience, in trust, in the quiet strength that only comes when a man has fully surrendered to his calling. One evening, as the sun stretched long shadows across the valley, Ruel found him standing at the edge of the cliff. "You've been quiet lately," Ruel said, approaching with a water skin in hand. "The whole village is still talking about what you said, but you've said little since." "I don't need to say more," Nahum replied. "The message is alive now. It will go where it's meant to go." Ruel handed him the water skin. "People are asking if you'll go to Nineveh yourself." "No," Nahum said softly. "This message wasn't meant for my feet. It was meant for their ears. Others will carry it. I've done what I was told." He looked out toward the horizon. "The storm is building. Even now they don't see it. They feast, they boast, they build taller walls, but the flood is coming." Ruel said nothing for a while. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "Do you feel peace?" Nahum smiled, just faintly. "Yes, because justice brings peace. Not instantly, not easily, but in the end." They stood together, watching as the last light touched the hills. Below them, the village of Elkosh glowed with the warmth of oil lamps. A dog barked in the distance. Someone sang a quiet melody near a cooking fire. Life went on. And yet, something eternal hovered in the air, something greater than one man or one prophecy. Nahum placed his hand over his heart, eyes still on the north. "The Lord is good," he whispered, more to himself than to Ruel. "A refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him." The wind shifted slightly, and in the stillness, Nahum knew the God who waits is also the God who acts, and his justice was already on the move. The final word came not with thunder, but with stillness. One early morning, as the sky turned from navy to soft gray, a rider passed through Elkosh, mud on his cloak, sweat on his brow, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't stop to trade or rest. He only said one sentence before pressing on: "Nineveh has fallen." That was all, but it was enough. Nahum was sitting outside his home, sharpening a small blade for trimming fig branches. He paused, watching the rider disappear over the southern road, then stood slowly. Ruel came rushing from the olive press, breath short. "You heard him?" Nahum nodded. "So it's done," Ruel said, nearly in awe. "The great city, the one no one thought could fall, it's gone?" "Just as God said it would be," Nahum answered. "Not by swords or strength, but by justice." In the days that followed, news spread like wildfire. The Tigris had flooded its banks and weakened the gates. Enemies from outside had rushed in while the city's walls crumbled. The proud empire that once paraded its cruelty across nations now lay in silence. Its kings buried, its towers shattered, its people scattered like dust. People from nearby villages began coming to Elkosh, not just to ask questions, but to listen. They wanted to hear the words that had come before the fall. Nahum, always quiet, always watchful, opened the scroll and read again. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. He will not leave the guilty unpunished." Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. He read with calm assurance, not triumph, not pride. This wasn't a story of destruction. It was a story of justice, fulfilled, a story that reminded the faithful that God sees, that He hears, that even when it seems like the wicked win, their time does not last forever. After reading, Nahum would return to the ridge where the wind met the stone and the sky opened wide. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he was silent, but he always listened. Because Nahum understood something few others did. God's justice may come slowly, but when it comes, it leaves behind something even greater: hope. And hope, once planted, could grow in the soil of every heart that had waited, wept, and wondered. Nahum had spoken the message, and now he rested in its truth. The prophet was finished, but the peace he had proclaimed was just beginning.